All right. I think we're live here. Welcome to the Thriving Marriage Podcast. With me today is Sergio. Sergio's been working with us for quite some time, and he's been wanting to join me on the podcast today. So welcome, Sergio. I'm glad to have you here.
Still in the workshops, in the trainings. If you book an assessment call yet, we likely have talk together. So yeah, we're going to be discussing some new things here with Marc today. Excited to see you guys here.
Exactly. So one of the topics that we're discussing today is how to save your marriage when your spouse doesn't want to. We're going to talk about a few other things as well. But before we get into all of that, we always like to share a client win of the week. This one is coming from permission from Jude. Jude says, the High Thrive Marriage Reboot works. I'm just wondering if I'm reading this right. Anyways, my husband says that he wants to make things work. He swept me away for a night for my birthday in another city for dinner and pampering, breakfast in bed, and then came home to cake and the kids and cards that made me cry. This program works. It's been about 6 months separated in the same home, but finally seen some changes. So this is exactly like what we talk about a lot on the podcast here is we see a lot of crazy situations, like 6+ months feeling separated in the same home to situations like this. And this isn't really that uncommon. I think a lot of people get into these situations and where the spouse has one foot out the door and they're like, there's nothing to be done. But I don't know, Sergio, you talk to a lot of the clients. You see a fair amount of this as well, don't you?
People believe that because their spouse is doing this or that, they cannot get it back. There is no hope. But Marc, over the years, have taught me that it's not really about what your spouse is doing or saying. It's about the story in her head. Most of the time, the story in her head is crazy, right? It's what we call the alcoholic analogy, right?
Mm-hmm.
She's an emotional alcoholic. She's not an actual alcoholic, though we get our fair share of people with alcohol problems for sure. But her being an alcoholic is making her, of course, do all these crazy things. You should not be surprised that an alcoholic is acting crazy, right? You should get to expect that behavior. So anytime your spouse is doing anything negative, we just tell the clients, expect that. It's normal, right? Because it's through that.
So, exactly. And so like these sort of cases here, it seems really hopeless or it seems really terrible. And like Sergio just said, these are the kind of things that we expect from the situation. So I'm so glad that this worked out for this one client. And like you said, these are the things that we see all the time. So I'm going to see even more of it. Anyway, Sergio, you were saying that you wanted to discuss a few things in particular, and we certainly want to get into the topic of today, like how to save your marriage when your spouse doesn't want to. But you were saying you wanted to bring up some things, I believe.
Yeah, because that's going to be the name of our next workshop. We're going to be doing a master class, another training coming up soon with a lot of new things. It's going to be an interesting experience too. Maybe we can discuss how to explain some of these very complicated concepts to people who don't really know much about the methodology itself. Because most of you guys have improved yourself. Most of you guys are trying to be a better husband, a better wife, are trying to listen more and trying to control your anger. All this great progress you guys are making, right? And we applaud that. That's beautiful. That's great. But it's not enough. Just because you change yourself, just because you improve yourself, doesn't mean that your spouse is going to see the change. And even if she sees the change, I was talking to somebody like 10 minutes ago that says that their spouse, said, hey, you look better, right? Just because they say that, it doesn't mean that it's going to change their story. It doesn't mean it's going to be enough to move things forward, right?
No, we see that all the time. Like we see clients come in and they say, well, I've been trying so hard. I've been doing all this stuff. I've been making all these changes. So why doesn't my husband or why doesn't my wife come back to me? And that's really, it's a mistake. It's the wrong kind of thinking with this. That's a little bit what you're saying there, right? It's
exactly.
It doesn't really even matter. Well, I mean, it does. It does matter what you're doing, but like that's not the full picture.
No, but it's not enough.
It's exactly that. There's just like, this is how everyone goes into it. They're like, and I think a lot of the other programs, when I look into them, this is how they approach things. They say, okay, well, if you're the better husband, if you just focus on yourself, or if you just make some self-improvements, everything's going to be good. And that's just really not the case.
No, that's for intermediate cases. For like intermediate easy cases, yes, that's really good advice. And some of these other people really good give good advice. But for extreme cases, the top 10%, like you guys, it's bullshit. It's not enough. It's like if you have a huge fire in your house and you're trying to just pour buckets of water into the fire. Is it good? Marc will answer technically. He will say yes. Better to put some water than nothing, right?
Sure.
I will answer, just more directly. It's nothing. It's meaningless. You're wasting your time. It's good for you, sure, but improving yourself is not enough to get her back, right? You should always improve yourself. Yeah.
It's good for you, as in like, yeah, it feels good throwing these buckets of water. It feels like you're doing something, right?
You can shower. It's not anything. It's not enough. If the problem was fixed by you going to the gym, by you being a better husband, by all these things, it would have been fixed by now. Sure. It's not the solution. The key goes into the keyhole, but it doesn't open the door. It's a mirage. It's an illusion. It's not the real solution.
All right. So I do think that like a couple, if we're talking about like what do people do with this, because we're saying, hey, what's the wrong way to think about this? I do think like a couple really big concepts, especially if you're looking at like early stages, searching, and correct me if I'm wrong. Correct me if you think that it's something different. I think the big two concepts at the early stages, you got to consider what access and narrative.
Yes.
Access, just to kind of define what we're talking about, access in my opinion, it's like this measure of comfort in the relationship. It's also like a measure of like how well your partner lets you into their life, how comfortable they are, how much they're actually going to listen
we need to really simplify that.
What do you mean?
I feel like we're going too deep there. How do we explain to people who are new listeners, don't know us? We're going to teach this in a workshop, right? So part of what I want to do today is like, I want to challenge you, Marc, because you know way more, to see if we can explain these concepts that you and I know so deeply as simple as possible, right? Because we're going to be teaching in this workshop next week about access, right? And why access is the only way to tell whether there is hope or not, right? So how would you rephrase it, like for somebody who's never heard of it? Like, what is access exactly?
Okay, well, as I'm thinking about it, it's just like, I'm really trying to simplify it down. As I'm thinking about it, it's just like, do you have contact? Do you have interactions with your spouse, and how comfortable are they with you? So like we could look at it on a bit of a spectrum. We encounter some people who say, my spouse is leaving and they don't want to talk to me at all. They might allow me to email them and text message them, they might say. And I say, great, that's some amount of access, right?
Yeah.
And that's really like I'm sorry, what was that?
Yeah, that's all we need. It's like the access, right? Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. And I think like at these early stages, people start to really freak out when they're saying, okay, I can only email and text. And you know what? That's fine. It's honestly, it's fine if you only have some minimal access. We deal with this all the time. There's a lot of things to consider, but I'm listening to Sergio a little bit here. I'm trying to like keep it simple and not go into too much depth here, but there's a lot of things to consider, but there's a lot of things that you can do to bump that access up. And that's what we want to go over in the masterclass next week. The other concept, though, we're talking about like narrative, right? And once again, trying to consider how to keep this simple. Like, to me, narrative is it's like the story that your partner is telling about you and the relationship. They're opinions. They're not necessarily facts. It's just what your partner says to themselves in their head about the situation. And those two things, I don't think a lot of people are really considering this, Sergio. What are you thinking there? Like, I think a lot of people are looking at what can I do? What kind of changes can I make? They're not really considering how do I have impact on what my partner story is and how to get more access here. They're not thinking about those things.
Exactly. And this is interesting. So you guys are listening, like really pay attention here, because it's going to be a hard kind of teaching moment. But to go back to to talk about narrative, the first point is, what are you guys looking at to tell if there is hope, right? When you are one day happy, one day sad, how is it working? Well, what you do is you look at your spouse, you see what she does, you analyze what she does, you say, oh, it's good, oh, it's bad. Based on that, you move kind of your hope, right? You say, oh, today I'm more hopeful, today I'm more hopeless, right? Mm-hmm. And that's not true. That doesn't work. That is wrong. And most of you guys need to realize that is not how you calculate hope. If you calculate hope based on the actions of somebody who is, by the mere definition, negative, that's what we know. She's an extreme case. She's going to be negative most of the time compared to how often she's positive, right? Mm-hmm. What do you expect her to do? Of course, she's going to file for divorce. She's going to have an affair. She's not going to want to talk to you. She's not going to do anything, of course. It is the expectation. So if you look at her that way, all you're doing is reinforcing yourself the idea that there is no hope, when her actions don't mean anything. Her fighting for divorce, her asking for separation, most of those cases don't mean that much, because with the cases we work with, which are really extreme cases, the reason she's acting that way is because there is a story in her head that is making her act that way. So when you look at the outputs, when you're looking at what she's throwing out there, right, what she says, what she does, it's biased. It's biased towards negative. So she's trying to convince you there is no hope effectively. The moment you believe it is when there is no hope. What you need to do is stop believing what she said or does. Sure, listen to her, sure, acknowledge her, whatever, that's not the point. It's not therapy, right? You need to mentally understand your mindset of, don't let her fool you into having no hope. I was talking with somebody a couple of weeks ago that his wife said things like, look, you can go out, you can go with another woman, I don't, just do whatever you want, it's over, there is no hope, just go with another woman. Mm-hmm. You believe that, right? Because she said it so convincingly, right? So logically, you're like, he's a logical businessman. He's like, okay, it's over, I'm going to go with another woman. He went with another woman. Weeks later, again, that was before he started working with us, but weeks later, he actually met the spouse again with some of the divorce proceedings and whatnot. She found out about this other woman, and she got so upset. She said, how could you do this to me? I love you so much.
How? I know exactly who you're talking about, Sergio. I've had some good conversations with him. Like, I get what you're saying there. It's like,
don't trust her.
Yeah, here's this person who's saying, don't even bother. Just go, just leave me. And then, like, how does that make sense? Where then she turns around and says, why did you do exactly what I told you to do? And gets upset about it. It's
exactly.
You're making a good point there, like, where it's really hard to gauge how hopeful things are just based off of how negative they're being.
You can't. It's like you play the roulette wheel and you're like trying to guess what the next number is. It's not how it works.
Well, we have to. Okay, I'm sure there's going to be some people who are going to have some argument here, and I'm sure like the argument is going to be like, well, okay, you're telling me that this is her story, that this is their story, that there's all these bad things, and the argument here is going to be that, well, there was actually factually some bad things that happened. Maybe
that's how the story got built.
Yeah, no, exactly. Like maybe you, the person listening, maybe you actually did cheat on your spouse, or maybe you were really angry and you called them names, or maybe there was a lot of arguments or something. And we're not trying to say that factually speaking, there weren't bad things, or that your spouse is crazy for believing that the situation is bad. That's not at all what we're trying to say here. It's more that, like, yes, of course, with everything that's happened, your spouse is going to be upset and they're going to be negative and they're not going to have hope, but that isn't really a good indicator of whether there's hope or not.
Hope, exactly. Because if you're getting your hope from somebody who is in more pain and more hopeless than you, what are you doing? It's like wrong. This doesn't make sense, right? That's not how you do things logically. If you want to be logical, don't believe what she says when she's not being logical. If you're here listening to us, you're likely dealing with an extreme case. The way you handle extreme cases is totally different from how you handle intermediate ones. Intermediate ones, you do the basic thing everyone talks about. Open communication, sure, but what if she doesn't want to talk to you? Only about the kids, very strict boundaries. Then what? Rebuild trust. Sure, you rebuild trust, but then what? She still doesn't see you as the husband. She still is not attracted to you. She's not in love with you. You can trust friends a lot. You can trust your enemies a lot to engage in negative behavior, right? She likely trusts you to engage in negative behavior now, right? The point is that all that general advice doesn't work out because it's intermediate cases. For extreme cases, we look at the story and we look at access, which is kind of to circle back to the main point, right? How do you tell if there is hope? I find it's easier to teach people in the negative, like how to not calculate hope, right? So how to not calculate hope is by looking at her. How to calculate hope, we have a lot of variables. We have around 115 different variables that we go through. So we cannot go through all of them. That's up to us to diagnose. But the main factors are how much access can you give us to her? How often can you talk to her? How often can you see her? How often can you phone call her? How often can you text her? Some of you guys are lucky enough to live in the same house. That's perfect. Most of our clients are not. That's why it's an extreme case, because they're living in a separate household. We have to come up with excuses to get them to see each other, to go out on dates, to do all these things, right? So access, and then how horrible the story is, which it depends a little bit. It's not that much of a factor compared to access. But if the story is really horrible, there is still hope as long as you have more access. I feel like how hard the story is, it's not an indicator of hope, but rather an indicator of how much access you're going to have to her. But I don't know. That's kind of my theory.
I see what you're saying there. Like, as an example, if, you have someone who is saying, people listening, your spouse is saying, oh, you've been abusive and I can't even stand the sight of you. And, like everything is horrible and terrible. And I can't believe I was ever married to you. That's a really difficult situation, but we can still have some positive impact there if we have more access and if we have some ability to talk about some of those things, if we have some ability to have an impact on that narrative.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And we have quite a few people live now watching us on Facebook too. So if you have any comments, let us know here in the chat on Facebook. We're happy to explain some of the things. But yeah, let us know your situation. We might be taking some examples to use from your cases if you want to share it there. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so that's an important point. Another concept that I think is going to be useful to them, it's going to be the escalation ladder maybe we go through. That'll be really interesting. Like how to go from texting to like having a date, being intimate. That's something most people don't even talk about.
Okay. So like you're talking about, we're talking about these two concepts, access and narrative. And you're talking about like, how do we actually go from point A to point B with access? Like, how do we actually improve some of that? How do we get the situation feel a little bit more comfortable so your partner is willing to go from just emailing to maybe texting and phone calls? Mm-hmm. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly, right? What I'm saying is that most people out there just giving like vague advice on like be a better husband, clean the house, listen to her actively, go to the gym, read books, go to therapy, whatever, right? That's what you should have been doing a long time ago, right? That's partly why this happened. Sure. But just because you do it now is not how it works, right? It's like you just started the fire. You cannot just do the same things that you would do to prevent a fire to put one off. This is not how it works.
Well, and I think like we get into this a little bit when I'm talking with clients, we talk about this going into like husband or wife mode, as in here's your spouse pulling away, and so you're going to go to them and try to do the things that would have worked a long time ago, like by declaring that you're so in love with them and telling them that you're going to fight for the marriage and telling them that you won't ever stop fighting for the marriage, and like you mentioned, like trying to take over everything.
We were reviewing some of the messages from clients, and this client particularly was conveying that I will never stop fighting for our marriage. Did you remember those messages?
Well, yeah, and it's a terrible message. It's like digging a deeper hole in that situation, which like doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense a little bit. Like here you are, of course, if you're wanting the relationship back, then shouldn't you tell them that you love them? And shouldn't you tell them that you're going to fight for things? And
But
And
she
at the
doesn't
same
see
time,
you that way. That's what they don't get. Like she
yeah,
doesn't see you as a potential candidate for a husband at all. It's like
yeah,
if you're dating her. I was telling this particular client. I think I read your conversation there as well. Because we get many clients with these things, and we always use the same analogies. So we usually tell clients, look, if you had a random woman in the street and you go up to them and you say, I love you so much, I'm always gonna fight for us, she's gonna call the cops.
yeah,
You need to
yeah,
understand that your wife or your husband has been thinking about this for a long time, has developed a stronghold of a narrative, right? A very well protected narrative that you didn't have time to assimilate yet. So they see you as their ex husband, whereas you see them as the wife that is a little checked out, which is not the case. Very checked out, the very extreme case. And the way you make somebody fall in love is not by proposing to them, it's by being around them, becoming their friend, becoming their good friend. Maybe you invite them to a movie, maybe you kiss them, right? And you escalate from there. That's what we do with clients, right? We work out what is the story of your spouse. Week after week, you talk to them. You go through what we call a cycle every week. So you have 2 or 3 practice interactions that you will practice with Marc or with your coach, right? You practice what you're going to say. We can be your spouse, you can be you, and then we switch the roles. And then as you go through these cycles, the story gets softer and softer. And as the story gets softer, we make you go ask for things in exchange. So we ask you to, you've changed a lot, right? And you've been showing her and she's been positive so far. Now you're going to ask to see her more often with an excuse. Like, hey, let's agree to be good co-parents, right? And again, that's extreme cases, right? If you're living with her, you're an extreme case, but it's a really good case. Most people we see are living separate, right? If you're living together, contact us right now. We can fix this immediately. It's super easy compared to a separation, right?
seriously, yeah,
But what I was saying is that, and again, that doesn't mean there is no hope if you're separated. We get most of our clients, in fact, being separated because most extreme cases are, by definition, separated, right? The point is, after all those cycles we go through, we escalate. We have a bit of a ladder, of a staircase, right? At the bottom, we have things like emailing her, which is the worst, right? Texting her, which is the second worst. Phone calling her, which is a bit better. Seeing her in person with an excuse. Seeing her in person as co-parents. Seeing her in person as friends. Seeing her in person as a date. Kissing her, being intimate, right? We have this whole ladder going up that most people don't realize is the ladder, the staircase they need to go up to. Because the moment you're kissing her again, you're being intimate with her, regardless of anything else, you have most of the work done. So our job is to change the story enough to get you to the next step. Enough so she wants to talk to you. Enough so she wants to see you in person as a co-parent. Enough so she can see you as a friend. Enough so she can consider maybe going out on a date with you. Enough so she can kiss you. Enough so you both can reconnect, right? It's all about the concept of enough and having clear steps, which unfortunately there is not out there. This kind of thing.
sure. And I'm going to point out, like, we're talking about these sort of things as like the early stages of fixing this. We haven't even really gotten into the whole meat and potatoes of this. Like, this is just to begin to get a little bit of traction in the situation. Like, we haven't even started discussing all these, like, the resistance phase and how there's very likely going to be some resistance to a lot of the changes that are being made. We're not talking about stages where we are starting to balance out the relationship, or we're
But people
starting
tend to get confused with that, I think, with the resistant stage. Like
Hmm.
they tend to think that, oh, I'm in the resistant stage because she's giving me resistance. And I'm like, no, you're not a client. You're not in any part of the treatment right now,
Yeah.
right? It's different.
Well, I'm sure they're probably getting a little bit of resistance, or I'm sure they're getting some rejection, but it's different. Like,
It's not a worthwhile trade. When we get resistance from the spouse, we do it because we're trying to make progress. So we're trading a good chance of making progress in exchange of a good chance of getting resistance. Most of you guys are playing in the neutral, are trying to play it safe, which means you are risking any resistance you get, you didn't get any payoff for it, very likely, or very small progress, right?
yeah.
I don't know what do you think.
I want to talk about that just a moment more. Like, you're talking about the kinds of actions people do and the resistance they get and the kind of payout that they get from all that. I think one of the things that I talk about a lot especially at the earlier stages, is, I give some very, very specific, clear-cut, structured advice on how to go and approach their spouse, how to talk to their spouse. And usually somewhere in there is some amount of, towards the end of a conversation, some sort of bid for something healthy. And I tell the clients this, I'm like, you are making this bid for some sort of solution. Like, hey, maybe we can talk about this some, like a little bit more. But I'm also telling them, like, at the same time, they're probably going to say no. They're probably going to put up some resistance. They're probably going to reject that little offer. And I'm saying I'll tell the clients, this is fine. This is actually exactly what we're expecting. And
Exactly.
the whole thing there, we're just trying to plant some seeds. And this is, I think, a concept that a lot of people don't get. It's, in my mind, a lot of these early stage actions are about setting up a certain position within the relationship rather than actually getting the results. There's a lot of setup that's needed to be able to get things to move along a little bit later on down the road. And people, I think a lot of clients are like, okay, I'm doing these actions and it's not getting them to change. They're not coming back to me. Why isn't this working? This is a hopeless situation and I can't make anything to work. And that's just the wrong way to view it. And I think this is why we get so many people coming in and say, oh, there's nothing I can do and it's hopeless because I tried doing this one little thing. I tried having this one conversation and they said no. I'm like, that's not even, you're like 10 steps behind where you think that you actually are, and we're not expecting them to say yes quite yet, and that's fine. You get what I mean, Sergio? Like, what are your thoughts there?
No, I agree mostly. Like, I think we should disagree more if we were entertaining people.
Sure.
But I feel like we're just disagreeing with them, with like the outside, because people just have the courage. People just genuinely have the courage to think that they can just get dealt in life an extreme case, a top 5, 10% case, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they think they can wing it. That's the challenge we really have. It's not fixing the problem. It's getting you guys to understand that you cannot fix it and that there is a solution. Our biggest challenge is less convincing your spouse to come back. It's a challenge, but we have time for that. It's to convince you guys that, A, you're not hopeless. You just don't know how to assess hope. And B, it's not that there is no solution. It's that you just don't know what to do because you're inside of the bottle. You cannot read the label. And everyone outside, all of the experts, all of the therapists, all of the marriage conference talks, like, Oprah, Tony Robbins, whatever, right? Like big names even, are giving you vague advice that is not for you. You're dealing with an extreme case. That's our job here today. It's not to teach you what to do to fix, because that's going to take a long time, a lot of thinking. Marc cannot teach you how he thinks about the problem, right? Sure. Once you practice with him, once you role play with him, and you see how he reacts and what he says and what he would do for you, then it's how you learn through actual practice, right? But anyway, it's just kind of interesting to reflect on that, right? That the real enemy is not the spouse; it's your own head a little bit. But yeah.
When you said there, like there's a lot of okay advice out there, but just not for a lot of the people who are listening to us about this particular problem. Because I could go in and Google like how to get your wife to talk to you. And, I actually have Googled that sometimes. Occasionally I'll go in and I'll see what other people are saying, and just to kind of get a good gauge on like what the advice is out there. And I look at all this advice and I'm like, man, this really doesn't fit what's going on with the people that I'm talking to, because so much of that advice out there is intended for a different part in the stage in the relationship. And so many people out there are, they would go right along with a lot of what our clients are saying. It's like, if it gets to this point, there's no hope. And that's just, it's not the case. I mean, we were just sharing just a moment ago, just earlier, Sergio, where we were saying, hey, someone was saying, hey, I was separated. I was in an in-home separation for 6 months, and then they made it all work. I was talking to a couple that I've been working with for a little while. They were living separately for 1.5 years. And now they're at a point where they are discussing moving back in together, and like just they're going over the logistics.
And they didn't join as a couple. When you started working with them, they were not a couple. Only one.
No. It was just the wife that started working with me. He didn't want to talk to me at first. not at all.
Of course. And he shouldn't even know she was working with you, right? Because she's trying to change the story. So the more they know about you trying to know, the harder it is.
Yeah, no, this particular couple that I'm thinking of, like, she started working with me. She wasn't telling him that she was working with me, and then at some point I was like, okay, he's getting on board. I'm thinking he's ready to talk with me too. And so he started joining in the sessions, and there's still some challenges there, but it was really interesting to watch that go from a situation where they had been separated for a year and a half, and then go to this point where they're like, this was the problem part of the conversation last time I spoke with them. They're like, well, we're getting out on a lot of dates and we're trying to navigate like buying this house together again. It's just like, sometimes I just want to tell him that I need more time with him. I was like, well, why don't you just tell him? And she's like, okay, I will. And he was sitting right there, and he's like, oh, okay, you need some more time with me? Fine. And that was the big problem that they brought up this last week. And I was like, oh, well, that's, anyways, I'm not trying to be dismissive or trivialize those sort of cases. I'm just saying, like, we can get people to go from the situation where they hardly talk together, don't want to see each other, to getting out on dates, talking about moving back in, talking about buying a house again together. And that's what we do.
Exactly, right? And here we have an example. I think we were discussing it earlier, but clients that do whatever they want on their own, like we tell them to do something, they do it, but then they try to be proactive and do things on their own, right?
Yeah.
And it just backfires because people on their own just don't know what to do. But yeah, I think we should wrap it up soon as well. But we covered quite a bit of things today. We're going to be covering these things on the workshop too. Today's podcast was a little bit different, right? We focus a bit more on like the strategies that we follow on our day-to-day, some concepts or some of you are already familiar with. We didn't talk much about the alcoholic analogy, but hopefully you guys are somewhat familiar with it. But yeah, if you guys like this, there's no.
Yeah, I also want to, I love for people to comment if they, we're trying a little bit something different here. Sergio and I were just trying to just have a conversation about the topic at hand. So we're thinking about making a little bit of a shift in our podcast. So if you guys appreciated the conversation that Sergio and I had, let us know. If you think it's total crap what we tried this week, tell us that too. We're always open to feedback, and it's just, here's the thing, like Sergio and myself and Heather, we're in this every day. We've been doing this for like years and years, and so sometimes we get into this position where we know exactly what we're talking about. We talk about it every day. We read up on stuff about this all the time, and we're always kind of trying to consider, like, how is this being presented to all of you? And so I'll just admit, on my end, it's hard for me to always see that. I always appreciate feedback. So if you have any, please let us know. Anyways, any last thoughts, Sergio, before we wrap up?
No,
here?
Just it's interesting how there's so many people who are like texting their spouse, I love you so much, or hey, I had a nice day, I love you. And they're thinking that that's going to solve the problem. And then the spouse is texting back like, I don't care, or like a short response, or hey, I sent a longest message saying like, I want to set some boundaries. And then you're like, oh my God, why is this happening? And I'm like, dude, your spouse doesn't see you as her husband. You need to understand that. You have to date her again. You need to think that you're dating her. If you go all out and you're texting her every day, you have a date with a girl and you text her 40 times in the same day saying you love her, it's not going to fly. And this girl, you have a disadvantage, right? She doesn't like you. So you have to know what you're doing, but you have an advantage too, compared to a random girl you might meet in a club, right? Or in a bar or in a school or whatever, right? This one can't leave that easily, right? You guys have been together for years, you have kids together. She has a reason to talk to you, right? So you have the disadvantage of she doesn't like you that much compared to at the beginning. You have the advantage that she can just leave, right? And she can just do that. As long as you don't mess up, you have really good chances. But yeah.
Yep, exactly. All right. Well, with that, I think we'll wrap up here. And as Sergio was mentioning, we are going to be going more in depth, a little bit more technical with our conversation in the masterclass next week. So look out for some announcements for that. And otherwise, we will continue on with our podcast next week. Hope you all can make it. All right. See you, everyone.
Thanks for listening to The Thriving Marriage, your A to Z blueprint for not just surviving marriage, but thriving. Until next time, my friends, thrive on.